Okay, so today you're on the Scottish borders. William Morgan, I'm talking to you today. William Morgan, the author of four massive volumes entitled "The Strongholds of Satan," which is immediately going to sell it to a lot of my subscribers, I would imagine. Volumes on the history of long defunct racecourses and deeds and misdeeds that happened on the turf back in the mists of time. And when I say massive, William, can you hold up? You've just finished volume 4.
Yeah, there we are.
Just spin it to the side a bit there. Look. That is what I'm talking about. When I say massive,
about 1,000 pages.
1,000 pages.
But luckily, not all my drivel. So because there's lots of maps there and lots of photographs, including some with a drone. But my wife did say that they're not the coffee table books; they're the coffee table. So they are and very valuable as doorstops too. But yeah, they are big.
Do you remember the first paragraph you wrote?
Not the first paragraph. The first person I properly talked to. The reason I started it was I rode as an amateur, and luckily started with Walter Wharton, who some will remember, and he trained on an old racecourse called Crowson Park between Melton Mowbray and Grantham, not far from my home. And that was quite interesting in itself. But one day there was a retired policeman digging up champagne bottles from next to the rubble of the old stand, which has sadly been cleared now. But and I got talking to him. And Walter was saying, come over here, you're supposed to be schooling, like this, you see. But I chatted this chap, and then Dick Warden, who was the bloodstock agent that brought Sheikh Mohammed into racing. I was a mud student for the Curragh Bloodstock Agency, David Minton and Anthony Stroud in their more youthful times. He said that my kinsmen, the Antonys, who've just been inducted into the Hall of Fame in Cheltenham, funny enough, this just now, they stopped Brown Jack the first time he won at Bournemouth with Tiny Burford, their stopping jockey, on board. And Tiny Burford was supposed to stop him the next time out at Wolverhampton, and he failed to do so. He couldn't hold him, and he won at 106. And Dick Warden said they were furious, absolutely furious with Tiny. And then, of course, the next race he won was the Champion Hurdle, which wasn't such a big race in those days, but, it was still quite an achievement. And then he went on, of course, to become this famous flat horse that won the Queen Alexandra, was it 5 times? I can't remember, at Royal Ascot. He became a real standing dish and had a book written about him. But, I thought to myself, stopping Brown Jack, and at Bournemouth, which was a course that actually lasted 3 years before it became first an aerodrome and then was built on. So that started me, and the first person I really talked to about it, really, even before talking to Dick Warden, was Walter Easterby, who was Mick and Peter's uncle, and he was 96, I think it was, and it was in 1978. So it has been, and I ran a stud for 20 years with, started off with 4 stallions. So it's been going alongside. And the ways of getting the information has changed so much. I had to do everything by hand to start with. Now you can look so much up on the internet. I'm one of the few people probably still doing research that actually remember the reading room of the British Museum with the great rotunda and the famous Hoffman joke. Have you ever tried the echo in the reading room of the British Museum? So it's been a long, long project.
A lifetime's work, basically, isn't it?
It is really, I suppose. I had no idea that it would go on this long. I thought, well, there'd be about 100 courses, because there are 59 now, at the time. And I thought, well, there'd be another 100 maybe gone. And it turns out there are over 1,000 that are in a calendar, roughly speaking. I've slightly widened it well, obviously before the first calendar was assembled by a remarkable man. He must have been John Cheney in 1727. How he got all the information, I don't know. He was based in Arundel. And but there were race meetings before then, of some importance, and a few of the very interesting ones. I've let them leak into it. But so, roughly speaking, 1,000 courses under rules at one time or other that were in a racing calendar of a description. So it is much bigger, and the fact that it's become much more of a social history, really. I thought, because one of the other things that got me going was, funny things that happened to me when I was riding on race courses. There always seemed to be something going on, even, in the 1970s and 80s when I sort of really got going. And actually the journalists very quickly realised, the journalists of the time from the 18th century onwards, very quickly realised that no one's actually interested in the result of a race, or most of them, 5 minutes after their run. So they would describe the scene that was all around them, all the fairs, the minstrels, the punch-ups, the pinching of the money, and et cetera, people galloping all over the place and knocking over people, killing them sometimes. And most famously in Volume 4, which we'll come on to, a duel that followed on from a race meeting.
So, yeah, because that is the just anybody you can read a list of results, and they are meaningless because most of the races would have been ultimately meaningless, wouldn't they? So the stories behind it are the fascinating ones. I mean, I saw you first on Nick Luck. And I was looking into, as we talked about previously, Tiverton races, and I saw that you'd included Tiverton races. So I've purchased all 4 volumes now. But I must admit, I've barely scraped the surface. But I will get through them before I turn up my toes. But the way you've written it does take, it's fascinating, all the stories. And I mean, where do you find, I suppose, that was in the local papers?
Yes, mainly the local papers. And actually, as now, the national papers would get things from the local papers, and the local papers, yes, and of course, because they were the local papers, they would be interested in the social side of it. And as you say, results were particularly meaningless in those days because a lot of the horses were very local, and there was no collateral form book as such. The calendars were the only thing, and that's why handicapping couldn't really happen until the 1770s. The first handicap, I think, actually was 1786, and just off the top of my head, it was run at Abingdon anyway. A meeting long gone, right by the Marcham Road. If anyone does the junction of the A34 and the A415, and there's a little bit of the course, if you know what you're looking at, you can still see, and that's where the first handicap. But until then, they couldn't handicap, and the results were very local, so there wasn't much interest in the horses as such, so it was much more the individuals. And then, I mean, it was a deferential age, so they would talk about the great and good, but there were other stories. I mean, for example, at Abingdon, in fact, on one occasion, in those days, juries, a lot of race meetings were held at the assizes because that's when people would gather in town, so they would hold a race meeting at the same time. And at Abingdon, on one occasion, in those days, juries were locked in while they made their decision. They weren't allowed out until they made a decision. And the clerk to the court decided, I'm off to the races, locked the jury in, went off to the races and forgot them. So the jury were shut in and were banging on the door to try and get out because they were getting desperate for food, drink, and probably a pee, I should think. So, and he was much berated. So that, again, these are the sort of stories that emerge from these race meetings, and that's what they would talk about, because it's far more interesting than the races, really, except unless something dramatic happened,
No, there are other videos dotted around the internet that are still up that we've done talking about the first 3 volumes. So give us a few highlights from. So Volume 4 is up north, isn't it?
It's up north, aye. Or I should say it's south too, because I live over the border in Scotland. So that sounded more Morningside actually rather than Dumfriesshire. But anyway, yes, it covers Cheshire, Yorkshire, and north into Scotland. I mean, there were 80 meetings odd in Scotland, as far away as Dingwall and Inverness and Aberdeen, and it's a great variety. It's a book of great variety. 1, 3, and 4. Book 2 is slightly more. There were more local meetings. There wasn't the great big conurbations, as it were. But in Book 4, you've got things like Yorkshire, which is obviously really effectively the home of the thoroughbred. So quite a few meetings, especially early on there. You've got the great big conurbation of Manchester. And you say you've got meetings scattered far away in Scotland, and even the Isle of Man actually is in this book as well. So it's a book of sort of great variety of the meetings, and therefore quite a variety of what took place at them.
Okay, I'm assuming most of those up north were summer meetings, were they?
Yes, I mean, yeah, there were jumping meetings, of course, and quite a few hunt steeplechases, so they would be in the winter. Sort of Eggleston Hunt, but they were. And Creek Hunt, they were sort of they were in genuine point-to-points, most of them. But the big meetings, obviously Manchester, which is probably the mightiest oak to have fallen of any racecourse. Although Birmingham is technically Britain's second city, Manchester was a bigger racing town, if you like, and the industrial might, of that part of Lancashire, and joined with the West Riding of Yorkshire. And in fact, the absenteeism largely that went on, people going to the races, was one of the things that propelled bank holidays, in the wider world. Such was racing. I mean, there'd be tens of thousands of people. There's a good picture in the book of Manchester races in 1913, and there are probably 60, 70,000 people there. And sometimes it was estimated, probably wrongly, there would be 120,000 people at Manchester races. So, I mean, enormous crowds. And the place is effectively shut down, and that was the sort of propellant, as I say, to bank holidays.
Okay, so you've got, talking about these books, I mean, how do you find out about racecourses that haven't existed since sometimes maybe 17 something? I mean, how, do you put a Google in for, I mean, where do you start trying to find them? And is your worst nightmare a book turning up from 1720 with about 50 that you haven't found yet?
Well, that hasn't happened, but a slight equivalent happened, which is actually leading to a small book 5, which I'm just going to send out, which is addenda and corrigenda, the additions. Because actually what did happen after book 3 came out, suddenly on eBay, a cache of maps appeared, that a chap who'd bought Railway Arno found them at the bottom of the box and started to put them on eBay. And these maps would have originated almost certainly from Weatherby's, who must have asked the clerks of the course in 1905 and in late 1924 for maps of the courses from different clerks. And these ones, I don't know whether they asked them for all tracks, but these ones had survived anyway. And so it has altered a few. Retford Hunt, for example, the map that was in the thing is different, somewhat different, not completely different, but somewhat different from the one I've got. And also Loughborough, the chase course was because Loughborough had a slightly thing where they ran one way for the hurdles and the other way for the chases. But I was always suspicious that I hadn't got the full story about Loughborough and the chase course, and sure enough, I hadn't. But now I have. But it was rather annoying that it came out. This cache of maps came out a few weeks after I published it, rather than a few weeks before I published. But so to say, there's going to be a bit of a book 5, just to, and people who've been kind enough, such as, suckers like yourself. I mean, no, try and find people such as yourself who've bought all 4 books. I'm just going to send them this little booklet. Although, in fact, if people go to the website, which is, if you Google Strongholds of Satan, it comes up, but it's mainhomepress.co.uk. And there is, if you look at the books, so book 5, you can actually now, I've done it with my wonderful setter, Pete Mackenzie. We've done it so that you can now download and print off all these extra bits of information that have arisen since the books were published. So people can have a look. In fact, even those who haven't bought the books can download them and get a few maps for free. So there we are.
There'll be plenty of people doing that, I imagine.
Yeah.
So currently, it's a bit frustrating for all of us that love racing and betting. We're being told that betting and gambling is terribly wrong, and that we all shouldn't do it anymore, and anyone that does do it will be taxed and saved from themselves and all that sort of stuff. But just looking at the title of your book, it's no new thing, is it? I mean, people were being told that it was a wicked thing to do, go to the races and have a shekel on the one you fancied in the match.
Yeah,
300 years ago.
Absolutely. Well, there was an explosion of gambling when the Stuart court returned with the Restoration in 1660, and it accelerated. And obviously, famously, Queen Anne started Royal Ascot, but also in 1711 was the first attempt by the government to try and restrain some of the gambling. And in that year, 1711, they actually made bets recoverable in law for the first time. And because they thought if any bet over £10, actually, and it was known as the qui tam Act, which is whosoever, qui tam in Latin, and they thought that if bets over £10 were covered by law, that would stop people putting on big bets, because before it was just a debt of honour, and So in fact, that did anything but it made the punters were still quite happy to put the money on, and the bookmakers were happy to take bigger and bigger bets because they could, the blacklegs as they were known in those days, because they reckoned they could get the money back. In fact, that even after a different law, which I'll come on to a second, it was not until the 1830s the government reversed this because there was and made bets a debt of honour again, because the courts were being clogged, especially around London. There were so many bets and disputes over bets that they said, right, that's it, we're getting fed up with it. Anyway, clearly that didn't work. So in the late 1730s, the government introduced a number of acts to restrain gambling of all sorts, be it faro, which was a dice game, and cards and that sort of thing. And the last one of these in 1739 was with racing. And the way they sought to restrain what they called excessive gambling was to up the prize money to £50 per race, or a fine of £200, an enormous sum by the standards of then. You're talking tens of thousands of pounds, and so that every race had to be worth 50 quid. And they initially that did wipe out quite a few fixtures, but very, very soon, and this is typical, if you like, is that people run away. They find ways around it, because all life is a gamble. You step out on the road, it's a gamble. It is intrinsic to human nature to bet or to gamble, however you want to phrase that word. It is always taking a risk, if you like, and this is the fun way of taking a risk. And so what happened is that some just ignored it. If you're there was a race at Penistone in the West Riding of Yorkshire 3 years after the act was on the statute books, but they got round it in all sorts of different ways. For example, they'd say, yes, the race is worth £50, but unfortunately you had to pay £20 to next year's prize. You had to give £10 to the clerk of the course. You had to give £5 to have the drums and fifes play. You had to pay £5 to have the church bells rung. You had to pay £5 to this and the other to have stakes put in the ground. So guess what? You end up with a fiver. And all the rest goes back into the fund. And of course, that money never changed hands. And in fact, the law withered on the vine. And this is what the government will find. In the modern age, it'll be because people avoid it by going to unlicensed bookmakers, etc., as they're already doing in large numbers. But this law particularly sort of pretty much died a death, and everyone's nearly forgotten about it. But at Rochdale races in 1822, I think it was, or 1825, I can't remember when, a man called Edge decided that this latent law could be brought out back into action, and he charged some people with running an illegal race at Rochdale. And sure enough, and this is in book 4, and sure enough, it went to court. It wasn't defended. No one could deny the fact. And in fact, the Edge brought the owner of the second horse in as his star witness. And a rowdy crowd turned up, and the judge pretty quickly realised that if he wanted a courthouse of any meaningful nature at the end of this, he better find some way of seeing Edge off. So the whole case went through pretty much, and Edge thought, yes, I've got my... Because what happened was, because originally in 1740 there was no policeman, what happened was the informer got £100 out of if he informed, and another £100 went to charity. So Edge thought, I'm on for my £100 here. And... so the judge very quickly thought, and he said, Mr. Edge, tell me this. Were the participants, were they stallions, geldings, or mares? And Edge sort of looked and sort of, I have no idea. Non-suited, case dismissed. Great cheers. And so Edge trudged off, no man the richer. And a few years later, it was actually the Duke of Portland from the House of Lords that actually consigned that law to history. So those are the government trying to control gambling. And the Jockey Club tried in 1870, again by raising prize money, to try and head off further government action because of the trouble in the meetings they were having around London. There were a lot of very disreputable meetings around London. And that's one of the reasons Gatwick started, because the races had been at Croydon, and what the government eventually did, it meant that racecourses had to have a licence. And so and the local magistrates got trickier and trickier at Croydon, which was a big and well-run meeting. So they moved out of the area that was under the supervision, which was 12 miles within Charing Cross, and they moved out to Gatwick, and that's the Croydon meeting moved to Gatwick, which of course is subsequently now under the airport. So there's been a history of people trying to control the gambling, and the fact is you won't. You've got to, and the extraordinary thing is, I think it's in 2005, a court decision made Gordon Brown put racing again, that it become a debt that is recoverable, which is completely daft, because it'd be far better to say to bookmakers, no, you won't get your money if you don't get paid. The bookmakers would police themselves, because they don't want to be making bets with people that won't pay. So the government, in so many ways, has made a complete foul up of this.
But the interesting, you mentioned the blacklegs. I'm interested in the history of bookmaking, and you've probably read it, The Art of Legging. It seems to me that the original bookmakers were the first sort of trickle-down wealth sharers, weren't they? Relieving aristocratic idiots of their money wholesale on the racecourse.
Well, it was said that Crockford took all the spare money of a generation and a little more. And Crockford was a fascinating man in himself, actually, because he spent all his time basically inside and was so pale. It was said even when he was gambling, no one was quite sure whether he was dead or alive. And in what was the infamous Derby of 1844, which was won by a 4-year-old called Running Rain, and we can talk a bit more on Lord George Bentinck in a minute if you want, is that Crockford died a few days beforehand, before the Derby, and his widow, clearly not a very sentimental person, these bets, you see, were made personally, so that if he died, the bets were all void. And she looked at the book and reckoned he was on a good thing. So what she did, she propped him in the window on the main route to the Derby from London, and everyone smiled and waved, as it were, and I don't know whether she actually sort of manipulated his hand or whatever, but because he was so pale, no one could tell. So she kept his death a secret until after the Derby, and then rushed round, collected money, because it did turn out to be a very good book, and then declared him dead. Crockford, say, took all the spare money. And I suppose one of the saddest, and if there was ever a project I'd love to do, it centres on a lady called the Pocket Venus, Lady Florence Paget, who walked into Marshall and Snellgrove as the affianced of Henry Chaplin, Squire of Blankney of Lincolnshire, and walked out of Marshall and Snellgrove 10 minutes later, eloping with the Marquis of Hastings. And now both of these men were big owners of racehorses and rivals, and their campaign against each other, or I mean more from the Hastings side to Chaplin, continued, and it reached its summit in the Derby of 1867, when Chaplin had the favourite for the Derby, called Hermit, and Hastings plunged against Hermit a go-go, and a few days before the Derby, there were rumours that Hermit was bleeding, which is a condition where horses bleed from the nose, and it's endemic in the thoroughbred, and in fact the pre-thoroughbred, and of course, and that affects their performance. So Hastings plunged even more against, and Henry Chaplin, to be fair to him, wrote to Hastings and said, look, don't believe the rumours. I hear you're betting very heavily against Hermit. I assure you as a gentleman that he's fine. Hastings, of course, being the man he was, and if you ever see photographs of Hastings, he is the ultimate chinless wonder. He looks a thick aristocrat, and he was. But a man with an enormous fortune he started with anyway. And he took this as red rag to a bull. He thought, Chaplin's trying to put me away here, plunged even more money onto Hermit. And the Derby of 1867 was run in a snowstorm, and Hermit won by a head. So completely ruin of Hastings, who'd won the Oaks, was it the year before or 2 years before, with a lovely mare called a Lady Elizabeth, and he had to sell all his horses but a Lady Elizabeth. And a few years later he died of his dissipation, drinking and what have you, and his final words are said to have been, Hermit's Derby broke my heart, but I didn't show it, did I? So these were if you like, the people being fleeced, and ordinary people too, because it wasn't just the big bookmakers. There was a man called John Davis, who you probably know of, the Leviathan he was called, and he took a lot of money off people in the 1850s and 60s, and the market was huge in those days. Richard Ten Broeck, who owned Lexington, one of the first Triple Crown winners in America, he came from America to England because the opportunities to bet were so much greater. So there wasn't, but even on the course, again, one of the things the journalists wrote about are these, the local yokels would be tricked by these chancers. You could buy, these little, supposedly little sacks of gold, which were supposedly worth 4 shillings, and of course they were worthless. And so there were always people trying to fleece someone.
Sorry, what do you remember the first sort of reference as actual bookmakers standing on a track taking bets, or would that have preceded your books?
Nothing precedes my books.
That's what I'm saying.
Racing at Croydon in 1572.
Yes,
and Hyde Park in the 13th century.
What? I mean, people would have been
preceded
betting at the betting post and all that sort of stuff.
Oh, long before then. But the ordinary newspapers would record it, because the thing, of course, is that the races were run in heats. And it was one of the interesting things about it. You didn't have to wait weeks to see, or indeed, half a year to see Ben against Eubank again, or whatever. You saw the rematch half an hour later. And this is what the rubbing houses were, and the last rubbing house is at Salisbury. And these horses will be rubbed down as best they could. And those who have been coursing would understand this. You have different rounds of coursing. So they run one heat, and then they would half an hour later run a heat. So there was huge betting on the result of the first heat, how that would affect the next two, because the essence of heat racing was you had to win 2 heats. So so if you had exhausted yourself in the first heat to win it, the second horse, and this is where distancing, that famous quote, "Eclipse first, the rest nowhere," actually was a bet, because what happened was, in order to keep, because a horse could sit way off the pace and come with it and win the second and third heats, not having hardly run at all. So what they conceived of very early on was the distance post. And so about a furlong and a half from the finish, they'd have a distance post. And the chair fence at Liverpool was the chair where the distance judge sat for the flat course in the old days. And it was a furlong and a bit from the finish. So that if you hadn't passed the distance chair before the winner had passed the winning post, you were distanced. You were deemed distanced, and you couldn't take part. So that that was an effort to keep the horses together. And then people would sort of bet on the things. And so the bet was that Eclipse would pass the winning post before any other horse got to the distance post. And indeed, he won that bet. So if you were deemed distance, that was it. So you had these instant bets, and a lot of those were recorded in the press. So you're talking, the first newspapers that recorded meetings would be things like the Reading Mercury, the Northampton Mercury. So you're beginning to get reports of betting. I couldn't tell you an exact year off the top of my head, but probably from the 1720s, 1730s onwards. And the professionals, there was a core of people and they were known as the knowing ones. And the usual thing was, I'm afraid, was the knowing ones were deeply taken in. Was one a great phrase, and they'd done their money. And the blacklegs, and it became ever more professional. I can't remember the name. You might remember the name of the brothers who originally ran toll gates, and it was said they owned the English cricket team of the 1830s. So they could fix any result in cricket that they wanted to, really, and they then became big betting people on the racecourses. But it was much more difficult for them because it was such a wider world. You've got thousands of people there, and it was more difficult to it was more difficult to fix simply from a gambling point of view. And it was quite often, it was, of course, the owners that were cheating. And the Running Rein Derby, it was almost certain that Running Rein was not the only 4-year-old to win a Derby. The man who campaigned greatly against it was Lord George Bentinck, and he did it from simply a personal point of view. He wasn't, some great moral character, but he didn't like being cheated. He himself had won the Ledger of 1836, with Elis, and he did that normally horses will walk to the races and be there 10 days or so or a week beforehand. In fact, it was quite a condition of entering the races that you had to stay in one of the inns that contributed to the race fund for a week so that everybody locally made money. So I'm going to cough now. He wanted to devise a thing of getting the best money on without the bookmakers knowing about Elis's form. And he invented the first horse box, or one of the first, not actually, one of the first horse boxes. And because his horses were trained not far from Goodwood, and he was going all the way to Doncaster. And so he got these horses, he got a carriage made that was pulled by 6 horses, and he put Elis in it, and took him along, and he took him via Lichfield, which is all about in volume 3, and it's on the front, and he galloped Elis round Lichfield racecourse on the way to keep him fit. Excuse me. And sure enough, the money, Elis was going out and out and out in the betting because, the bookmakers were saying, where's Elis? Where's Elis? Where's Elis? Elis turns up 3 days before the meeting. Money plunges on, and he won the ledger very easily. So Bentinck spent much of his time, if you like, indulging in tax avoidance, but what he didn't like was tax evasion. And so he pursued the owners of Running Rein, but he got himself into further trouble because one of the meetings in Book 4 is Heaton Park, which is on the northern edge of Manchester and is now partly under a boating lake, owned by Manchester City Council. And it was run by the owner of the park, Lord Wilton. Sorry, I'm going to cough again. We're both suffering from this, aren't we? It's obviously sinful attendance at a racecourse. Wilton ran this meeting, and it was run about 2 weeks after the Ledger meeting. And it was the final meeting before the aristocracy would depart to go shooting, basically. And there wouldn't be many meetings at Tattersall's, the settling houses, on a Monday. They'd set at Tattersall's in Hyde Park Corner, or near Hyde Park Corner, on a Monday in Knightsbridge. And Oswald Deston, Squire Oswald Deston, one of the most famous sportsmen of his time, who once shot 99 partridge out of 100 in a competition with flintlock shotguns, so quite a performance. He was fed up. He thought that Wilton was helping his cronies, like Bentinck, with the handicapping, and that it wasn't fair on him, although he was Squire Oswald Deston, an old Etonian, pretty high up the pecking order. So he got a horse from Ireland to try and win a race that Wingbill handicapped. Unfortunately, he galloped in at the Ledger meeting, and he was spotted by a few people, and he wasn't going to get the odds he wanted. So he decided to stop the horse on the first day of the Heaton Park meeting, which he did. And on the second day of the Heaton Park meeting, Bentinck, who was taking bets, it didn't have to be a bookmaker, Bentinck himself, he saw the odds going in on, I think the horse was called Irish Ball, I think, something like that. And he stood bets against the horse. And he called out, just like a bookmaker, I'll take 4 to 1 or whatever. And Oswald Deston, he was cantering to the start, pulled up the horse, said, I'll have some of that. So he bets with Bentinck, wins very easily. Bentinck, of course, calls foul, and he said, you've done us properly this time, Squire. You see, all the betting men, you've done us properly this time. And Bentinck was pretty slow in paying. And so the next spring, when they all gather again for the Newmarket Craven meeting, and they go to the thing, Oswald Deston says, what about my bet? And Bentinck says, well, you can count this if you like. And Oswald Deston said, well, I could count when I was at Eton. Bentinck threw the money on the floor, which was very insulting, of course. Oswald Deston picks the money up and challenges into a duel. Now, you can imagine who would be the favourite in that race. Oswald Deston having shot 99 partridge out of 100. So basically, Bentinck was a dead duck, but he still, as a man of honour, had to take on this duel. So they tried to stop the duel. A man called George Payne, who was master of the pike and a friend to everybody, went to Oswald Deston and said, look, if you shoot Bentinck dead, never mind you might be hanged, but no one will ever speak to you again if you shoot Bentinck. So they have this duel, and depending on who you believe, Bentinck shoots and misses, Osbaldeston shoots, and according to some shot wide, according to Osbaldeston himself, who wrote an autobiography, shot through Bentinck's hat, and all was settled and everything like that, and that happened, and it's all described in fuller detail in book 4. I should incidentally say that there was a duel following a race in the 1750s where Lord March was one of the duelists involved. He took this man on, and the other man in the duel brought a coffin with him, and he put it down and says, "Lord March, that's for you." And Lord March blanched and settled the bet. So, so betting can have pretty serious consequences, never mind losing a shirt.
Tremendous. So, I mean, these books are obviously chock full of stories like that. And they're available from
yes, well, the website is www.mainholm.press, which is MAINHOLM for mother, press.co.uk, I should say. But if you Google Strongholds of Satan, it comes up on the search engine, and that'll take you to the site. They're not cheap books, I will say. In terms of, I hope they're good value, but they're things that volume 1 is 70, volume 2 is 80, and the next two are £90 each, because I make a few pounds a book, if I'm lucky, really, just on the setting and the printing. This last one, the setting and printing, cost me 21,000 quid to produce 300 copies, and about half or a bit more than that are spoken for. So, so I'll just switch that up a minute.
William, when I was a young man, and I was convinced by reading all the reviews in the Sporting Life that the time form racehorses books were essential to a racing gentleman and guaranteed to be to hold their value and be worth a fortune. I remember paying £52 in 1980 for a copy of 1985 for a copy of Time Form Chasers and Hurdlers, I think.
Yeah.
So I think your books, compared to those, are going to be pretty much more value. Hope that's not going to be in a private message coming up there.
No. It's just about. I still just help a little bit with the Thoroughbred Stallion Guide. I'm really retired, but this just is just. I help them out with lists and everything else, and I can't switch my own phone off. Anyway, that's now finished. So technology is not my strong point.
We're warts and all in these videos.
Yeah, well, exactly. It goes to show it's real, doesn't it? Not AI. So, but no, I mean, funny enough, there's a book called The Greyhound and the Hare, and that Mark Prescott did with Charles Blanning about coursing and everything over the years, and it was originally £60, and they did 1,000 of them. Actually, quite a few went to America, and if you want one of those now, you've got to pay about £500 to get one. Now, I have to say, my books are a little way from that. But one time, long after you and I are probably, pushed off this mortal coal, these books almost surely will be worth that, fun enough, because it's amazing how they just sort of disappear. I'm going to say that the last 2 volumes, I've only done 300 of them. I got a bit carried away with the first one, so the garage is a bit full of those. But, I've sold about 500 of the first one. I've sold over 300 or 400 of the second one, 320, 330. And then these I've sold 200 and something out of 300 of the third one. And obviously the fourth one's only just out. But as I say, over half of those are spoken for. So I wouldn't say that people will miss the boat if they don't get on the phone within the next 10 minutes. But I like to think eventually they'll run out. But the thing is, I've tried to price them. I don't, what surprised me is an awful lot of people who live. It's amazing where the enthusiasm comes from. Actually, it comes from all sorts. The great and good are always the meanest anyway. That's why they're great and good. And people are amazing how they. There was one funny thing. I won't mention his name, but he came to me. I was sitting with my books at Cheltenham, as you know, and a chap came to me and said, "Oh, I've had a really good day. I've got the place spot up today, £400. When I come back I'm going home on Sunday, and that's when I'll pick up buy your books." And I said, "That's absolutely fine. You're very kind." And he came back looking slightly more, or one of the books he wanted, and anyway, he came back on day 3 and tried to get a discount really because he'd done all his money. The next 2 days, the bookmakers had got him back, so his place spot of 400 quid, whatever it was, had dissolved sadly.
Never
But
count it
still
before the
very
end of the
kindly
meeting.
bought a book.
Oh, good man. Never count it before the end of the meeting. Yeah, I imagine that international posting has been a bit pricey, but anyway,
Well,
people can.
the books in the UK sell for a tenner, posted for a tenner, and actually even 2 books post for a tenner. In Ireland, it's about 20 quid, and to America, I've sold a number to America. It's about 35 quid. So yeah. I mean, it's because they are 4 kilos each. So, but it's not as daft. I mean, it seems far more daft. Sending a Christmas card costs about 2 quid these days.
Exactly.
Yes, one sort of thing about bookmaking. I rode at Wolverhampton when I was very young, the old Wolverhampton. And this old boy came up to me and said, "Do you bet?" And I said, "Well, no." He said, "Well, if any was," he said, "I've been coming here 35 years. It's the same book, it's different punters." And yes, so yeah.
That's quite a good Birmingham accent. That.
Oh, thanks very much.
Can you hold the book up again so that people can see
Yes.
what we've been talking about? There it is. But
you hope you won't get
one
sued
of
by your
those.
postman. The cover on there is Whitehaven races, and you see it's rather sort of grand looking there. There are quite a number of photographs of the stand in actuality, which is basically a farmhouse. You'll see it looks very different, but and they're about to put 700 houses on it. Actually, one of the saddest is one of the courses in here is Morpeth, and the racecourse at Cottingwood Common. Up to about 6 months ago, you could cheerfully walk round and you could race on it nearly tomorrow. And they're in the process of putting 800 houses on it. Isn't that sad? Beautiful course.
It is. Tiverton Racecourse has got a school on it. It used to have a plastic factory.
Yeah.
So there you go. I'm sure there's still a few coins buried under there that people dropped on the muddier of August bank holidays.
Yes, that's right.
Anyway, William, so thank you very much for your time. So if people sort of search you out, they will also probably find the other videos we've done, which is concentrated on the earlier volumes. So, if you really are one of these people that wants to do your research before shelling out your 70, 80, 90 quid, just Google William Morgan, Strongholds of Satan, and details will be up where to get the book from. So what's the next project then? You must have a lot of time on your hands now.
Well, this is the hedge laying season. I go off laying some of my hedges around the thing
around the estate
in the good Leicestershire style, not Cumberland or Dumfriesshire style. Dumfriesshire style is you lean them right over because it's really for sheep, whereas we're keeping cattle and sheep in. So mine is more 45-degree angle. I wouldn't win any prizes, but a lot of the hedges have got grown out, so they battle away, and I cuss and swear at these blackthorn and thing hedges always grabbing me. But it's a great thing. I haven't really got any say, and it would be wonderful if someone is out there who's younger to do a melodrama of the Pocket Venus. It's a wonderful story, a very sad story, because actually she married after Hastings died. She married Sir George Chetwynd, and he was a racehorse owner. He was a very heavy betting man, and he was accused at the Gimcrack speech by Lord Durham of basically not running his horses fairly in order to maintain his stable, betting coups. And he sued Durham and was rewarded a farthing in damages. So her first husband was ruined. Her second husband was effectively ruined and wrote actually 2 enormously turgid volumes in his own defence afterwards, and ended up in Monte Carlo, which in those days wasn't so smart as it is now. And so Lady Florence didn't have much luck really, but it would make a wonderful melodrama. But the idea of getting it through all these film things, getting a film made. The writing of a screenplay would be the simplest bit, and I don't think I have the energy to do it, I'm afraid. But maybe someone younger could take it on. It's actually, there is a book called The Pocket Venus that's well worth a read. It's a very sad, say Hastings was a tragic figure, really.
Where does it feature? Where does it feature in your book, William?
It doesn't so much, actually. To be absolutely honest, it doesn't so much, because
I'm just going to go and look it up.
No. Well, it doesn't really feature, because obviously the real denouement is in the Derby, which of course is still there. I do have a little chapter at the end of each volume that shows how the existing courses have changed. For example, Goodwood had a great big loop, where they pull up, had a loop on the other end, so they could run 4-mile races, and actually had where they ride round a loop at the top at Goodwood, there was a loop further out than that. So I've done maps got maps of the courses that exist now when they've changed, where they've changed. So but yeah, so that's not a story very much in my books, although Chaplin and Hastings do appear a number of times. They clashed quite a lot at Stockbridge, the racecourse in Hampshire, where the remains of the stand are still there. And so there's a bit, and I do just briefly recount that story, I think. Okay. But the book for that is The Pocket Venus.
Okay, so everybody, Strongholds of Satan. There's enough there to keep us all going until we pop our clogs and join the people that you've written about. Yeah. So I very much look forward to reading mine, and I definitely will all the way through by the end of my days. Plenty to keep me going, and I'm also going to Google the Pocket Venus, so goodness knows what might come up. So I'm blaming you if I get all sorts. Do you know?
I thought the Strongholds of Satan, I'd get all sorts of Miss Whiplash and everything like that. Not one. Not one.
But the Pocket Venus might sort that out for us. Anyway, so I'm gonna check. Thanks very much for your time.
Pleasure.
And if anybody has watched this and then they get hold of William, just tell him that you saw the video, because I get a bit kudos. And brilliant. Thank you very much. Thanks very much for your time.
You've already been very helpful.
Wow, it's well worth it. It's good. It's a great body of work. And so thanks for your time, and I'll see you on the turf at some point.
Time you came to Carlisle, Ole.
Hello everyone, just a quick one. If you have enjoyed these videos and are enjoying these videos, can you please like and subscribe to my channel? Thanks very much.